morning, everyone, and welcome. The purpose of this call is to go over the Tariff Framework. This is for the RC Rate Design Terms and Conditions Initiative. My name is Christina Osborne. I work in Stakeholder Affairs. I'll be facilitating the web conference. Also joining me in the room from legal, I have John Anders and John Spomer. From Finance, April Gordon and Ryan Fugazio, and from Infrastructure Contracts, I have Debbie Levine. John Anders is actually going to be walking through the language and the service agreement on this call today. Just to let you know, we are recording this webinar, and we'll make that recording available on the initiative webpage. Look for that early next week, and that's just for you if you want to go back and listen to it at your convenience. It's there for you. We'll leave it out there probably about a month. We just ask that if you reprint the recording, if you just contact the ISO to ask for permission first. We greatly appreciate that. The tariff language and the service agreement are posted out on the initiative webpage. Again, we're just going to, this is this informational call just to walk through the language. We are going to ask for you to provide some written comments on the language. Those will be due August 10th, and then we're going to have another call to provide responses to your comments on August 20th. We'll send out a market notice with details for that call. So with that, I'll turn it over to John Anders.
Thanks, Christina. This is John Anders from our legal department here at the ISO. And we just wanted to take an opportunity, particularly for those entities that may be new to receiving services from the ISO and how all of this works, just to provide a high-level overview, kind of what I'd call the tariff framework. For those who've been following the initiative, you probably know that yesterday our Board of Governors approved the proposal, so we will be moving forward and filing this tariff language. The target date for that is still the end of next month, end of August. So really the purpose of the call, like I said, and the tariff is all about implementing the policy. We're not here to dream up new policies, and we really rely on our stakeholders to provide us with valuable insights into the language that we've proposed in the tariff. And the reason we post this in Word is really so that stakeholders can provide us with red line edits and comments, explaining. We found this to be invaluable. We believe that, at the end of the day, you end up with a better product, lots of eyes on the details to make sure all of the mechanics, work, including cross-references and grammar and all the rest of it. So don't be shy. We really appreciate every proposed edit. So hopefully this overview gives you the background that you may need to improve, your overall understanding, and it just results in, better comments and feedback on August 10 when you submit your comments. So kind of with that overall background, I guess I'll talk a little bit about this Section 19, which is a currently blank section of the tariff. So we will be including this language in that section of the tariff. We've shown it here in clean format. It would be reflected in a red line if it were filed as an e-tariff amendment, but it would be kind of messy here, and then it'd be very difficult to see your proposed edits. So we've presented it here in clean format. And for those of you who may be familiar with the Energy Imbalance Market Tariff Framework, we sort of started with that approach, if you will. And the reason we did that is it just seemed that external entities may already be familiar with that, and it seemed to work in that context, so that with some revisions it hopefully will work well here as well. The biggest difference between this tariff language and what was proposed in Section 29, the Energy Imbalance Market Tariff, is there's really a lot less integration with the rest of the tariff. There's no scheduling coordinator relationship required for RC customers doing business with the ISO. So this really isolates these rules and settlement provisions and all of that to this Section 19 and any cross-references in here. So URC customers, they'll be unique in that sense. Some of you may also be scheduling coordinators, but for purposes of RC services, it is the RC services agreement and this section 19 that will govern that relationship. So really with that, I think what I'll do is I'll go section by section, and I'll go reasonably quickly through the tariff, just provide some context for each of the sections, and then we'll open it up for questions. So in section 19.1, you really have these general provisions here that describe the relationship between these tariff provisions and some of the other requirements, either in the tariff itself or in the NERC reliability standards. And you'll see that we've proposed some order of precedent language that would ensure that these provisions govern over any inconsistency with other provisions of the tariff, and then also that the NERC reliability standards would govern over these tariff provisions if there were any inconsistency in that respect. And we've done that to ensure that we remain in line with the NERC reliability standards without having to revisit and amend these tariff provisions. But there's really not a lot in here about that, so we'll get to that in a minute. So that's section 19.1, and then 19.2 is really all about what needs to happen in order for, first of all, the ISO to provide the services. We obviously need to be certified as a reliability coordinator, and then for RC customers to receive the services. And here in this section, we have talked about the implementation of the services and some of the details around the onboarding process, and also some of the prerequisites to qualify for receiving the services, what everyone needs to do in order to implement the services. And all of this really leads up to then the ISO providing the services. I will note that we had fairly narrowly drafted the initial onboarding dates in this section, and that was, we may need to revisit that a little bit now that we've heard from at least one entity that they may be interested in joining the ISO on July 1, 2019 as an RC customer. But we'll work through that before we file the agreement and see what may or may not need to be done there. So that's really section 19.2. It's all about getting ready for or making sure the ISO is ready and making sure the customers are ready to implement the RC services. So then in 19.3 and 19.4, we talk a little bit about what we've generally called supplemental services, and we've called out here the hosted advanced network application services and the physical security review services as additional services that are eligible, and how you would go about receiving those services, which will really be through elections or nominations made when you sign the RC services agreement. That's that. Moving on, we get to section 19.5, and this is now begins really the sort of the scope of the services, if you will, and the obligations of the ISO as the reliability coordinator, and the RC customer obligations. So first, with respect to the ISO, this is really the core services, so this is why we've called out the supplemental services separately. So we're just referencing here what we consider to be the core services for a reliability coordinator. We will be providing those to customers in accordance with the applicable NERC reliability standards. The tariff is drafted in a way that it means including without limitation. So if going forward, say an additional scope of responsibility were added to the reliability coordinator function, that would automatically flow through the tariff and be delivered to RC customers because of the way the framework of the tariff is set up, with the reference to the NERC standards governing over any inconsistency. Similarly, if something were removed from the scope of responsibility for the RC, that would also automatically flow through and be implemented according to the NERC standards by the ISO as the reliability coordinator. We have this other KISO reliability responsibilities section, and this is really trying to separate, and this is, the functional separation of the reliability coordinator from the other responsibilities of the ISO, and there's a parallel provision for RC customers. And I'll just note here, we have indicated that these other functions, transmission operator, authority, and other functions, are separate from the RC function, but that as a TOP and a balancing authority, the ISO must also comply with applicable obligations in Section 19. So with that, we're really trying to say the RC has authority over the ISO according to these same provisions that the RC customers are committing to. So that's the idea there. And then...
Ask for questions, maybe? We have a couple people that are making comments.
Okay, let me get through this section 19.5, and then we'll come back to the questions. Sure. That sounds good. So then the RC customer obligations, again, it's sort of parallel construction. They're going to follow the obligations requirements of balancing authorities and transmission operators as required by the standards, and then there's some parallel construction where they're also segregated from their other reliability functions, so that it's not, we're not meddling in any of the responsibilities of the customers as the balancing authority or transmission operator or any other function, except to the extent required by this section of the tariff. And then the last area covered by this is really about the termination of those services, and that's all referenced to the agreement. So before we go on to Section 19.6, it does look like we have some questions in the queue. I don't know if they're related to the scope of services here or other areas, but hopefully we can answer those now. Okay.
Yes, that'd be great. Yeah, so if I know that a couple of you have submitted questions in the web. If you can actually verbally ask your question, that would help. So to enter the queue, you can press #2, and just please start by introducing yourself. So Jordan, let me know if anybody enters the queue.
Yes, we have 3 phone questions that just came in.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, hi, this is Joe Fina from Squamish.
Hi, Joe.
Hi. I was wondering if John, if you can take a step back and you can just provide a general overview of how the tariff fits in with the services agreement and with the business practice manual, and kind of how they all work together.
Sure, I can do that for you, Joe. I think we also went through this a little bit in one of the earlier stakeholder meetings, but the mechanics of this would be that the pro forma services agreement that will be part of the tariff. So it is an attachment to the tariff. We use Appendix B for all of our pro forma services agreements. So that form agreement would be signed by the customers. In that agreement, there would be a specific RC services date, which under the current understanding would be July 1, 2019 or November 1, 2019. So the customer then would also elect whether they wanted the supplemental services, and that would trigger, of course, those provisions. So sign that agreement. That agreement then references Section 19 of the tariff. So we've updated the draft services agreement with some information that has evolved, some cross-references that didn't previously exist, and other details to bring that up to date. So they would sign that agreement. That would then bind them under, I think it's section, or is it article? Section Article 2. This agreement is subject to Section 19 of the CAISO tariff, which is incorporated herein. So all of these provisions then of the ISO tariff would apply to the RC customers, and that is how this would fit in. Now, for RC customers, the universe of tariff provisions applicable to them would be limited to Section 19 and one cross-reference section of the rest of the tariff, which is the penalties and sanctions provisions, which are also included in this tariff language, and that's Section 14.7. Reliability coordinator customers that are also or within the ISO's balancing authority area, and we can get into this in a minute, their settlement is a little bit different because we're allocating internally to CAISO balancing authority area load. That would be in accordance with this Section 11.20.9, which is also redlined in this tariff here. That's the tariff. And then here in the tariff, and we'll take the onboarding requirements as an example because we've just covered those in Section 19.2. There may be references to the business practice manuals which include additional details about onboarding and other terms and conditions of the services. So that's how that would work. As far as the applicable operating procedures, those I'll use the example in Section 19.5 on the roles and responsibilities of the customers. It says that the customers are going to do certain things in accordance with the applicable operating procedures. And so those are the procedures that are being developed through the RC steering committee and ultimately will be adopted by the Oversight Committee and administered by the Oversight Committee. And those are the things around outages and all of that. Because the ISO operates in a world where there's four elements of responsibility. One is the agreement, the other is the tariff, another is the business practice manuals, and another is the operating procedures. So that's the framework. Does that help, Joe?
Yeah, that does help. And I may be just not aware, but if I take it that the business practice manual that's still in development or is forthcoming.
Yes. So the idea with the business practice manual would be that it would include what we call like sub-tariff details about, and that's why I used onboarding as an example, like the format, of a network model or something that will accept the SIM format and the this and that, or that outages might be, we might allow the use of the outage management system or what we call the OMS, or we might still process under the cause stuff for peak, and these kinds of things. All those kinds of details. And I bring up onboarding because that's the primary area, would be specified in a business practice manual. It's really how to take services from the ISO. And then the operating procedures, those are really going to be about how the services are delivered to the customers and how we comply with the NERC standards. So I don't know if that helps a little bit more.
Yeah, and this is Deb Levine. I just add that the business practice manuals are more the business side of the how everything fits together. A lot of us, myself included, are not attorneys, and while the attorneys do great at putting together tariff language, there has to be an interpretation as to how everything is actually going to work together. And that's what the intention of the business practice manuals are. It's the user of the RC services will look to the business practice manuals to get all of the detailed information as to how everything fits together.
And lastly, I guess, timing-wise, it's typical that we would publish the business practice manuals before the service or rate goes into effect. So it's our goal, I think, to publish a draft of the business practice manual through what we call the change management process and the BPM process, which is another public process where comments are allowed, and I think we're going to publish that no later than, I'm thinking after the tariff is filed, we're going to finalize that based on the filed tariff language and publish that so that everyone can see that before they have to sign an RC services. And we're targeting that, after the FERC order in mid-November by the end of the year. So you could expect us to publish the business practice manual so you could see all of that to complete the picture, in that October-November timeframe. So you wouldn't be being asked to sign an agreement where you haven't seen the full picture yet.
Okay, yeah, that's very helpful. I was wondering if I can ask you one specific question that I have that's a little bit different. In the 19.1B2, subsection C, there's a reference to the CAISO markets. Can you explain how the CAISO markets could impact an RC customer's compliance with the tariff?
Sure. So we don't think that should happen in any way, and so you can help us if you think this construction doesn't work. But this was used also in the energy imbalance market with some slightly different references. This is really intended to exclude all provisions of the CAISO tariff to the extent that they're not limited in any way. Or if they are specific to the CAISO controlled grid or balancing authority or the markets, they're excluded from any reference in this section. But there's other areas of the tariff, like the definitions, for example, and stuff like that we need to have available for interpretation. And so when it says not limited in their applicability, then that's really designed to say, okay, if it's not about the CAISO grid, the CAISO BA, or the CAISO markets, then it's relevant here, and it may be have some bearing on the interpretation of this Section 19. But that's why Section 19.1c comes into play, because if there's any inconsistency between this and any of those other things, the definitions or anything else that someone suggests are relevant, then it would be this Section 19 that would govern. So that's the idea. It's not as clear as it could be if you had a standalone tariff for RC services, but again, that's not how we're set up to do business, and similar to the way the rate design works, that's kind of enmeshed in all of this. So isolating it to Section 19, having this order of precedent language, and the rest is how we've managed to provide the services and still sort of function seamlessly as part of the overall business of the ISO.
Okay, thanks.
So it shouldn't apply to the CAISO market. That was a long way to say that, but I wanted to be clear about that.
Yeah, okay.
All right, Jordan. How many people are in the queue at this time?
Currently 3 more questions in the queue.
Okay, great.
And to our next caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hello, this is John. This is Sean Neal from Edisto Irrigation District. I had a question regarding Section 19.5B2B regarding RC customer obligations for data exchange. And the question I had was twofold. Just the thought as to the scope of the obligation reflected in the subpart, and the second question is what applicability or interrelation, if any, does the CAISO contemplate to existing data exchange agreements via PEAK or otherwise? Fair
enough, Sean. Okay, so this section B is really a broad section. So it's the data, the plans, the procedures, the studies, et cetera, and all of that exchanging with the ISO. And then, of course, most of this will be specified in the operating procedures, at least the scope of that, with the BPM maybe talking about formats and some of the other things like that. But as far as our plans going forward with data exchange, I think it is our understanding, and we'll have to work through this with the announcement of PEAK and its wind-down plans, but we were anticipating, and I think we've said this all along, that we didn't see any need to change anything about like the universal data sharing arrangement. So if, in fact, there's a wind-down of the PEAK reliability organization, we would contemplate executing sort of in the role of where PEAK sits now, something much like the universal data sharing agreement with all of the customers. I think there's going to be a lot of issues to think through on that, but that's what we were anticipating. Maybe there's some way they could assign us, or we could assume responsibilities without having to re-execute and save some of the mechanics. We haven't thought through all of those details, but that's the plan. Does that answer your question, Sean?
Yeah, John, those is the PEAK UDSA. As to the tariff provision itself, do you in the implementation of the operating procedures, do you contemplate that it would include language or some type of scope or limitation that the data exchanged or requested would be limited to that necessary to for the ISO to fulfill its reliability coordinator functions?
Oh yeah, I think that's we would be going beyond our purview if we were asking for data, plans, procedures, or things. I mean, this is really about what's the IRO 10. I'm not a reliability standard expert, but this is really what we're going to be asking for is all under the IRO 10, and we just kind of have a generic statement about all that in the tariff. But Sean, if we were to issue some request as the reliability coordinator and you felt it was beyond the scope of what's required or inconsistent with what we should be asking for as the reliability coordinator with concerns of markets or some other function in the ISO, we certainly it wouldn't be our intention to do that under this section of the tariff. So you'd have every right to complain about that.
John, thank you.
All right, Jordan, next question.
Of course. Caller, please go ahead. Your line has been unmuted.
Hi there, this is Nancy Serafino asking a question on behalf of SRP, Salt River Project. The RC services date provision on, let's see, what are we talking? The implementation of RC services to
B6?
B4? Yeah. It talks about the ISO in its discretion determining the RC services date. Can you, obviously this is a really serious thing for anyone taking these services, and the customers need to count on a cutover. So can you talk about the construct of that language and what you intended with putting it as a discretionary with the ISO?
Sure, Nancy, thanks. So you can help us if the construction doesn't work, but the intent here was to say for future, so we're going beyond 2019 now into 2020 and 1 and 2, 3, 4. For these April 1 target dates, we wanted to maintain some discretion because we've had things where April 1 was a religious holiday or something, like it was Easter Sunday and we moved it to April 4, so things like that can happen. We didn't want that to be an issue. People may change their minds and suddenly want to be implemented in the fall, and the ISO might say, oh, that's not a problem, and we don't want to have to be doing a waiver of this. So then the language was intended to say, except for the initial onboarding dates established in section 19.2b6. So down below we have these initial onboarding dates, which are really where we anticipate most of the movement to occur, and we were trying to be specific about those, and what we said there was no earlier than, and we can talk more about this, but we really didn't have precise information, and we're trying to do this before we have the exact scope and commitment from the customers. So I know it was Bank at the board meeting announced that they were interested in a July 1 start date. So I would focus on Section 6 and getting that right, and if you think we need any adjustments to Section 4. But we do want to retain that discretion going forward, so we don't end up in a place where we're locked in and have to amend the tariff or seek a waiver or something if it's not April 1 date.
Okay, that was very helpful. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, one of the examples is also, we're targeting April 1 for the onboarding after the initial onboarding. What happens if the entity isn't ready April 1, but they're ready May 1st? So we want to have the discretion to move it to May 1st if that's what would work out best for the RC customer coming on board in the future years.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense. And then just for my benefit, as you're setting up the implementation of RC services up above under 19.2B, you have some obligations for BAs and then some obligations for your TOPs. And the BAs are needing to talk about TOPs and when they'll be taking service, yet separately you're also putting that requirement on the TOPs within those same BAs. Can you just describe how that process, how you see the process working? And maybe this is going to be worked out in some of the operating procedures, but it was a little unclear how those two sections worked together to the extent that there appears to be some requirement for the BA to do stuff for TOPs, yet also separate requirements on the TOPs themselves.
Sure, I can try. We did struggle with this one a little bit and noodle around for a while, but the idea is that we have the primary customer would be the balancing authority, right? So you have to have a balancing authority that signs an RC services agreement, and then that whole balancing authority area is included in the reliability coordinator services of the ISO. Now, that balancing authority might also be a transmission operator, and its balancing authority is contiguous with its transmission system, so there's a one-to-one relationship, and we're done at Section 1 here, really. But there may be transmission operators embedded within that balancing authority area that are third parties or entities other than balancing authority, and we wanted to have a direct contractual relationship with those entities because we consider them to be RC customers of the ISO as well. And then later on, there's an election. Those are transmission operators in those balancing authorities can elect to be directly billed for their RC services, and in that case, then we would settle with those RC customers that were transmission operators. And I don't know how many of these circumstances there are, but we know of at least one, and that's in the Bonneville balancing area. I think there's up to like 11 transmission operators, and they don't want to be financially responsible for their RC services, and so that'll be set up in that way. I don't know. Does that help? I mean, that was the goal of these provisions. Hopefully we got close to the mark.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. I mean, one thing I just note is I would assume that even though you're establishing a contractual relationship with the TOP within a BA, the date for RC services would be the same for both. And I'm not sure how you work that out. Maybe it's a BPM, but okay, thank you. Appreciate your explanation.
Yeah, well, and Nancy, with the discretion on our end, we'll be able to manage that process pretty well. So.
Touche, John.
Okay, Jordan, we'll take the next question.
Absolutely. Caller, please go ahead. Your line has been unmuted.
Oh, hey, John. It's Ryan Sigurdson from Bonneville, and actually SRP and Snohomish asked all my questions, so we can move on.
Excellent.
Very well, Brian. Glad to hear you're on the call.
Thanks.
Jordan, do we have anybody else in the queue?
No further questions at this time.
Okay, so 19.6.
Okay. Well, I will resume the walkthrough here, and I think we'll just watch the queue and see and pause if there's some sort of accumulation of questions that suggests we should pause. So we're transitioning now, and this is a good point in time. Those first 5 sections were really about the setup of all of this, and now we're getting into the settlements and billing and data and all of that. So 19.6 is really intended to describe the mechanics of the RC customer's provision of the data and information that would form the basis of the settlement provisions, and what happens if the ISO receives a 0 value and things like that. So that's 19.6, and so that information for both external customers and customers in the ISO balancing area, we move to the settlements and billing. And here, this is where there's a bit of a fork in the road, and so customers in the ISO's balancing area would be settled in accordance with a current section of the tariff, which is our pass-through for peak reliability charges today under the tariff. And so what we'll do is we'll structure an effective date for these changes so that we pass through the peak charges for 2019 that we incurred at the beginning of that year to our internal customers, and then at the end of 2019, when we bill for that segment of the year where they're receiving services from the ISO, we bill our internal ISO customers under that section 1120.9. So we'll talk about that a little later, I think, but there's some red line changes. But the main point is here is that section applies only if you're an RC customer or a load-serving entity scheduling coordinator in the ISO's balancing authority area, and the expectation would be that there'd be no real change in anything for those customers, except that the rate would be different. It would be less. So that's the idea. For everyone else, this is the section for the settlement of the RC services charge. So again, this is the business relationship between those customers and the ISO. It's separate and distinct. It is not a scheduling coordinator relationship, which brings with it all kinds of other implications and responsibilities and all of that. So here's the mechanics of the settlements. I'm not going to walk through the details, but the goal here, of course, was to reflect the settlement provisions that are described in the draft final proposal. And what this really has done then is it references, and I'm going to skip ahead real quickly. I'm not going to. Well, Christina, you can go there. Well, let's go to Appendix F, Schedule 7, because this is really where the actual rate is described. So that's at the end of this first section. It starts on page 17.
Helpful. Sorry if I'm making you guys busy.
And so this is all of the ISO rates are included in Appendix F of our tariff. All of the rates, the grid management charges, the energy imbalance market, and all of that. And so here's a new Schedule 7 for the reliability coordinator services charge. And the idea here is to describe the formula for the rate, and also to establish, and probably the most important paragraph for this conversation here is the second paragraph, trying to establish for those initial onboarding dates the rates that were described in the draft final proposal, and then to describe how those rates would be adjusted. And I think Ryan at the board meeting yesterday did a good job of explaining that, but essentially July 1, the 2% rate would go into effect for customers in the ISO's balancing area and others that may be implemented on that date. And then for, I think for 4 months or something, those charges would be assessed. And then in November 1, the rate would go to 9%, and it would include all of the other entities that were onboarded at that time. And the invoicing for this, which is described back in the section 19.7 that we were just in, says that those invoices for that initial onboarding year would be invoiced at the same time as we were invoicing for the 2020 year. So I don't know if it's 2 invoices or what, but there'd be 2 charges, one for the prior year, the little whatever period of time you were receiving the services, whether that be for since July or since November, and then there'd be a new invoice for the following year, the 12-month period for 2020. So that's what that paragraph is trying to do, and it does connect back to where we were at. And then this also includes, the calculation of the rate and its formulaic sense, and then also identifies the minimum RC services charge of $5,000. And I don't know how much more I want to say about that, but that's how all of this is intended to work. And I think we can go back to section 19.8, which is on page 13. Okay. So we were just talking about the core RC services and the mechanics of all of that, and it's really important that we get these mechanics right. So I really, encourage your careful review, make sure nobody's confused or it's not clear as to when and how and what to do when and all of that. So we appreciate that. And then moving on, we have here the description of the HANA services or supplemental services and the HANA services charge and the mechanics of this. And I think this was reviewed with stakeholders as well. So hopefully this is a reflection of that. And we then have the supplemental services, the physical security review charges, and how that works. And these are both additional supplemental elective services, and they're also covered in the RC Services Agreement, which aligns with these provisions of the tariff. So that's all of the invoicing, settlement charges provisions that we have laid out here. We think it's complete. If we're missing anything, do let us know. If we've gotten anything wrong, please let us know. And then the next section starts with some of what I call the generic provisions. And here, again, I think you'll see in the RC Services Agreement that we've adjusted the references where necessary to refer to these Section 19 provisions instead of the other provisions of the ISO tariff applicable to some of these sort of general legal provisions. I'll go through them not one by one, but I'll point out that in the sort of the liability, we do refer back to the agreement, so there's kind of this relationship, but it's intended to say that the liability provisions in the agreement are what govern the RC customer's relationship with the ISO. I think there had been some discussion around that earlier, so that's trying to reflect that. So it points both directions, both from the agreement to these sections, and then in that case from this tariff back to the agreement, to make sure that people aren't subject to normal market Section 14 liability under the ISO tariff. That's the idea. we have our specific dispute resolution provisions here. We have the uncontrollable forces, confidentiality, and the like. We're happy to hear from you. We also have a kind of catch-all miscellaneous provisions from the ISO tariff. There's two other sections here. One on reliability coordinator oversight, and here we have pretty much outlined that there will be a RC oversight committee, and that they will provide input and oversight to our provision of the services, and that we will adopt a charter that prescribes the membership responsibilities of that oversight committee, and that everyone hopefully is aware that there's an ongoing process with the RC steering committee to develop the charter, and all of that will be made available when it's approved. I don't have my finger on the pulse right now of exactly when that's going to be, but I think that the steering committee met this week and will be meeting again probably in another few weeks.
Did post an updated charter this morning.
Oh, we did? Okay.
On the collaboration site, yeah.
Okay.
So I'm going to send out a weekly update and include, that'll be included in the update.
That's the collaboration site, and that's the site. It's not quite
secured, yeah.
Okay, so, yeah. And at some point, I do know that they intend to publish that. So I just don't. Yeah. Maybe,
yeah, we.
So that'll be it in as far as the tariff is concerned on oversight, just to ensure that we do establish the committee and that we have the charter, and then that from there on forward the charter would govern that function. The other provision I'd call out here is penalties. So you'll see in this section 19.15 that we refer to section 14.7 of the ISO's tariff regarding the allocation of penalties, and this section is also attached here to this document that starts on page 22. And we really have not changed the penalty allocation procedures, and we've just simply added a reference to RC customers, and we did this specifically so that everyone would see that and that it would be very clear, rather than doing it by references to market participants shall be read as references to RC customers and all that, because I think it doesn't work as well that way. So this is the way we proposed it, but I think everyone needs to remember that the primary source of funding for penalties received by the ISO is through our normal rates. And so I think that the draft final proposal did a pretty good job of explaining that process, and so the ISO operating reserves and adjust the rates accordingly to ensure that it's fully funded. And these provisions, which have not been implemented to date, would only be implemented in circumstances where it was appropriate to do so, and all of that would then be lead to a proceeding at FERC where RC customers would have the opportunity to weigh in on the proposed penalty allocation by the ISO. Let me just, I'll finish with, the definitions. We've added, these are new definitions specific to the RC function. We may want to start on page 16. And I haven't thought about it yet, but it might be a good idea to put RC in front of each of these, RC net energy for load and RC net generation or something, so they all appear in the same place in the tariff or something like that. It's easier to find them, but otherwise we have to be careful doing that sometimes, so we may end up with some scattering of provisions of definitions. But here's the universe of what we think is needed to support this new section 19 of the tariff. I think.
Let's go ahead. We'll pause for questions. If anybody has any questions on the sections just discussed? Again, press pound 2 if you want to introduce.
We do have one phone question here. Going to that caller now. Caller, please go ahead. Your line has been unmuted.
Hi, John Shawneel for Modesto Irrigation again. I had one question with regard to section 19.7 E4 with regard to late payment and default. And there's a reference in there to the ISO reserving the right to suspend the RC customer's RC services until time payment is received. And understanding that there are other procedural steps and safeguards in the RC services agreement, I'm wondering if you could speak to the interrelation between the two, and I'm just wondering if it would be worthwhile in this subsection of the tariff to refer to the RC services agreement.
This is not intended to be different than our rights under the services agreement, so that might be a good suggestion, Sean, to have a cross-reference. I mean, I think we discussed it in the stakeholder process, but the idea was that it'd be kind of a last resort. This is something the ISO, has to have the opportunity to do, but I think we all appreciate, given the reliability function, that we'd be more likely to exercise our right to issue supplemental invoices to the RC customers to make up the shortfall of any defaulting RC customer, at least for some period of time while we sorted out what the problem would be, and we'd be using our best efforts to collect from that entity. But this is just kind of the last resort. But I think, Sean, if you propose an edit or something that ties this more closely to the agreement, we'd be open to looking at that.
Thank you.
Any other questions, Jordan?
No further questions at this time.
Okay, so the last thing I'll cover, and it doesn't apply to most of you, I think, although I don't know exactly all who's on the phone, is starts on section, or page 18, is section 11.20.9, and I mentioned this earlier, and I won't go through it here, but these are edits to an existing section of the ISO tariff, which is how we collect peak reliability coordinator charges from our customers today. So this section would be amended as proposed here to be effective when the new ISO rates go into effect in July. And so we would be able to invoice these customers within our balancing area for the period of time in July, or from July 2019 to the end of 2019, and going forward under these provisions, because we would no longer be receiving invoices for our balancing authority area. I think the only thing I'd point out here is that for our customers, we do invoice scheduling coordinators and RC customers who are also scheduling coordinators. We just kind of had to make that clear because we don't just collect it from the 7 TOPs in our balancing area that are RC customers. We're also going to be collecting the from all load, which would be what a utility that was a VA, TOP, and all that would be doing in its balancing area. But there's a disconnect, or it's not a complete picture, so we need to collect from everybody. So that's what this provision allows us to do, is collect from all the load serving entities to make sure we account for all of the net energy for load in the ISO's BA and recover our share, or our proportionate share of the total cost for the RC area. So that's what this section is doing, and it doesn't apply to anyone outside of the ISO's balancing area. And with that, I hope that was helpful. We can do one last check for questions. Otherwise, we just are going to look forward to your comments on August 10th. And like I said earlier, we really appreciate red lines and comments explaining the proposed change. That helps us move more quickly. We only have 10 days to process all of your comments and generate a matrix and walk you all through that on August 20th. And then get it all wrapped up and finalized for filing on August 31. So the more precise you can be, better. And again, we really appreciate everyone's time. We appreciate everyone's eyes on these provisions. And I've already picked up at least one typo, so, you know, maybe we'll find more. But thank you.
Jordan, do we have anybody in the queue?
Yes, we did just get one question in the queue. We'll go to that caller now. Please go ahead. Your line has been unmuted.
Hi there. This is Kathleen Fraser from Energy Strategies. I just have a high-level question about the, I believe something was approved by your board yesterday. Was that the draft final proposal?
Yeah, that's correct. So the process is that the board approves the draft final proposal as presented in the memorandum that Phil Pettengill and Ryan Segazio presented to the board. So that has been adopted, and then that authorizes us to move forward with the filing of the tariff language to implement that proposal, which is what we're talking about.
Okay, so as long as the tariff changes or any comments you receive and changes that are made still fall within the general construct of the final draft proposal that was approved, then there will be no need for a reapproval of the board or anything like that. Is that correct?
That is correct. That's how the process generally works. As long as it's within the approved policy by the board, then we move forward, and you're correct.
Okay. Thanks. I'm coming in late to this process, so I appreciate the clarification.
No problem.
Jordan, do we have anybody else on the queue?
We do not. That was our last question in the queue.
Okay. So if you do have any follow-up questions, feel free to send those to the ISO-RC mailbox. We'll respond to them. Otherwise, we'll look forward to receiving your comments on the draft language August 10th. We'll have a call to provide responses to the comments that we received. That'll be on August 20th, and we will issue a market notice with the details of that call a week prior. So thank you all for joining us today. Have a great weekend. Thank you, Jordan, for your help.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining. The call is concluded. You may disconnect.